Peter Hottie.
Hey, it's been a really long day. I'm glad to see a few of you are still here, still awake. We're going to do our best during the next hour or so to keep you awake. For those of you who are coming in a little bit late, just a little word of advice that overall the presentation will be more enjoyable if you're sitting a little closer to the front, so don't lurk in the back. More on that later. So what are we here to do today? We're here to talk about QuickTime-4, the most minty fresh media technology available today. Yeah. So, you know, we just posted QuickTime-4 about a month ago. Steve and Avi and Phil told you quite a bit about it this morning. My goal during the session isn't to review all of that for you, but is to really sort of start to take you under the covers of what QuickTime-4 is, what we've tried to do with it, and most importantly, to help you understand the technologies that are there so that you can build those into your own applications. You know, the message that we've been telling to the world about QuickTime-4 is streaming. And by far, that's the most important part of what we're doing in QuickTime-4. But for those of you who have been here for the last 8 years, and that's how many years it has been since QuickTime was first announced here, you know there's a lot of other things that are part of the software. And so we're going to be telling you about some of those during the session as well. Let's see here. Whoops. If somebody could put the slides down in the monitors on the floor, that would be very helpful for me. Anyway, so what Steve talked about this morning, thank you, was really the fact that QuickTime-4 probably provides the highest quality streaming experience. We are working to have incredibly great content out there. We're building this thing on top of open standards, and because of that, we eliminate something that's incredibly important. We eliminate the server tax. There's two kinds of server taxes out there. And we'll just talk about each briefly. The first is, of course, the one imposed by real networks. And that's where they give you a free server that can support 5 simultaneous connections. And then when you want to go beyond that, you have to pay them about between $50 and $70 per simultaneous connection, which when you try to get to 1,000 simultaneous connects, it's a little painful. The other choice is to use Windows Media. That one is not so expensive, but it does eliminate choice. The only server that Windows Media runs on is Windows NT. So if you're like a lot of ISPs, a lot of internet houses, you really want to be able to run this stuff on a Unix box. And we'll have solutions for that as part of what QuickTime-4 is. I'm doing this session a little bit upside down. I got to tell you, like, the stuff that we usually put at the end here now, because we may not have time at the end. So there's some other sessions which will fill in some of the blanks from this one. These are all tomorrow afternoon, so basically if you just arrive at 1 o'clock and leave at about 6 and just sit, you'll see all the QuickTime sessions flash by you. There's an internet media session where we'll get into all the details about how you program for the new streaming capabilities of QuickTime. It's going to be a really great session on interactivity that's going to tell you all the great things that are going on with QuickTime-VR and wired movies. And we'll touch on some of those things today, though. There's a session on QuickTime for Java, and if you're doing anything with Java, you know that the media support within Java consists of animated GIFs and AU files. With QuickTime for Java, you can pretty much use all of QuickTime within Java. It's pretty amazing. And then at the end of the day tomorrow, when all of the engineers on the team are tired and beaten, you get to come and beat us some more. So you can ask us all the questions you have, and we'll try to do our best to answer them. There we go. Let's get 2 clicks here. Online support. You got to go to our developer page. It's just QuickTime/developer off the Apple site. Tons of documentation, sample code tools, and most importantly, something we call letters from the ice flow, which is the one page on the Apple website that I know of anyway, that the engineers on the QuickTime team can post things without having to go through all the normal review process. This means that this is unfiltered documentation direct from the team and generally is of really good quality. We just put some new stuff up there today, I believe, so you should always check that out. For those of you who want to talk to other developers using QuickTime, we have a number of mailing lists. These are incredibly great, really knowledgeable people. This is a fine time to actually mention that this session is being webcast live to anybody who actually read this mailing list today, since we just sent out the announcement this afternoon. But you can sign up for those. They're all free. I hit this button. It never goes. Oh, we got to go back. So yeah, we got to talk about licensing. Licensing is an interesting one. With QuickTime 3, we put together a new license. And last year we talked about it, and you told us what you thought of it. And we heard you, and we fixed it up as much as we could then. We continued to hear from you. And so we've made some more changes for QuickTime 4. A few things that you want to know. We haven't finished it yet. QuickTime 4 isn't done. But we'll get a final one to you when QuickTime 4 is final. Don't ask when that is. The licenses are still free. We got to get this into everybody's head. If you want to distribute QuickTime with your product, it's free, but you have to sign a piece of paper, which is a license agreement with Apple. So don't just put it on your CD, because then our lawyers will call you. But sign the piece of paper and put it on your CD, and you're basically there. You know, read the terms. There might be some other little details. There are other big things. There's no advertisement during install. We got rid of that big Get QuickTime Pro movie. You've all seen it enough. We have also replaced the Get QuickTime Pro movie on the desktop. We no longer require that you put that there. We no longer put it there ourselves. But what we do instead is we put a QuickTime Player alias on the desktop, which is, instead of something that you might be tempted to throw away, is actually something useful. So we think that's a big improvement. So, you know, there will be other adjustments. If you've got issues with the current license, now would be a really good time to get that feedback to us so we can make sure we cover those issues before we finish the QuickTime 4 license. But I think this is really big news. This is really great for a lot of developers out there who had issues. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the issue of download size. When we went out and talked to people about QuickTime 3, what they really told us was, it's a great product. We love everything it does. We hate the license, so we fixed that. But there's this little problem. It's huge. It's like 8 megabytes to download this thing, and I don't have the patience to do that. And you know, if you looked at the numbers that we got from the Apple website, you know, a huge percentage of the actual downloads were aborted partway through for one reason or another. So we knew in order to get QuickTime more widely adopted, we had to do something about that. So what we did was we worked really hard to decrease the download size. So you can see here sort of a comparison chart of different internet technologies on Mac. Numbers on Windows are a little different, but you know, more or less the same idea. You can see we used to be near the top there at about 6.3 megs, which is a lot. We're now less than half of that, and right down at the bottom at 2.8 megabytes. My favorite example on here, though, is AOL Instant Messenger, which is 3.2 megabytes so that you can type a message to your mom. It's very cool. But anyway, it's great software. I just don't know why it's quite so big. But anyway, so how did we get QuickTime from 6.3 megabytes down to 2.8 megabytes? Well, we took some things out, and then we had to figure out how to put them back in. So to do that, we created a brand new installer, and this is really an internet-savvy installer. And I just want to take you through what this looks like. I'm sure a lot of you have run it. But the biggest change is that you now have a choice of install packages. Basic, Playback, Deluxe, Authoring, and Custom. Basic is the small size. It's 2.8 megs. You don't get every feature. You get some subset of them. Deluxe gets you more. QuickTime Authoring is basically like QuickTime 3. And then Custom lets you choose from a multitude of options, more than one could possibly ever explain. So what's in Basic? This is kind of interesting and important to understand. Basic is the only thing you can rely with QuickTime 4 on people having on their machines. So if you're creating content, for example, you want to make sure, if at all possible, that you stick to these data types. That way your content will work on everybody's machine without them having to go get some more software. If you're writing an application, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, you obviously may need other pieces, especially if you use authoring, and there's some facilities to take care of that. How did we choose what's in Basic? We chose content that was great for streaming on the internet. We chose things that are very commonly used, like Cinepack. Deluxe adds a whole bunch more stuff. Support for MP3, QuickTime-VR, vector graphics, some effects, decompressors, sprites, all kinds of stuff. Deluxe actually isn't that huge a step up. It's maybe 600K right now, so it's actually not that big a download. Once you choose your package, you get asked this question about what's your connection speed. You know, on most web pages, every time you want to view a piece of content, you have to click on what your connection speed is. We figured your connection speed doesn't change very often. If you told us once, we would remember. And then we could choose for you. So you get to enter registration information. So if you've got a serial number, you can type it in there. You then get this, not. Somebody click my slide, thank you. It's gone. And then it downloads. And you get this nice dialog. And this is all modeless, so that you know, if you're on a modem and you've got something else to do, you can do that at the same time. Your machine isn't totally locked up. Then you go and you run the QuickTime software, and you might have an older movie around. You might have a movie around that needs a piece of software that you don't have. What happens in that case? Does the machine crash? That would be bad. So what we do is we have a new mechanism for handling missing components built into QuickTime 4. And what happens is QuickTime knows what pieces are still left out on the server, basically, which ones you don't have. And if your application or a movie tries to access one of those, we go ahead and put up one of these dialogues, something that says, you tried to use some software that you don't have. Do you want to go get it now? And this will come up basically in any application. So for example, if you're using Adobe Premiere and you don't have the DV codec and you need that, this dialog will come up in there. There's nothing you have to do in your application for this. I should show you a demo of what this looks like and what the update process is. To do that, if he's in the hall here somewhere, I have Jim Batson come up, and Jim's going to run the demo machines for me today. Something I forgot to mention is, of course, that QuickTime runs on Windows, and the Windows release of QuickTime 4 came out at exactly the same time as the Macintosh version. No annoying delays between technology releases like some people do. So we've got a basic version of QuickTime 4 installed on this Windows machine. We've gone to the Mortal Kombat website. The Mortal Kombat website has some trailers for something, I guess the movie. And they put them in different forms. Of course, QuickTime 3, Indeo 5, but also Indeo 3. Indeo 3 is not a format that's supported in the base QuickTime install because we don't really think it's that essential that everyone have it. So what happens when we try to view this? We get this web page, and it says we don't have the AVI file importer, which we'd also need, but we'll need Indeo 3 too, so we'll get that. So we see this dialog, we say do it now. It goes ahead and launches the updater, basically tell the updater to go ahead and download the software. It goes out to the website, pulls that down, and all we have to do then is go and refresh it.
You've seen the movies, you've played the video games, but nothing can prepare you for this.
So the thing that's nice about this mechanism is for users, it's incredibly transparent. They don't have to worry about it. For developers, it's also nice and transparent in that you don't have to do anything. If you want in your application to provide a little bit different user experience for dealing with missing components, if you don't want our dialogue to come up, but you'd like to give the user a customized message, you don't need to copy all this down. The documentation's on the website. But basically, you can query QuickTime and tell that certain components are available if the user runs the updater, but that they aren't currently installed on the system. And it's an easy check to do. It's very fast. Next thing is MP3. This morning, Phil and Steve showed you the glories of MP3 running under QuickTime on the Macintosh. I just wanted to mention a few more things about this for those of you who are curious about the details. Our MP3 decoder was licensed from Fraunhofer, which is a German research company that actually was the primary inventor of MP3. As a result, they're incredibly obsessive about the quality of the audio. And so if you compare the playback quality of QuickTime's MP3 versus just about anything else out there, you'll find that we compare quite favorably. We think that's really great because people want the best quality audio they can get. Another thing that we've done is not only supported MP3 files, but also tried to put support in for all the other places that MP3 is used. So it's not all that uncommon to find MP3 used in WAV or AVI files. So if you've got some of those, we just play them. AIFF and movie files have also been extended so that they now support MP3 as well. The final thing is that we don't just support download and play of MP3, although obviously that's what a lot of people like to do. We actually are able to do progressive download of MP3 so that you can play it while it's downloading. So again, we'll look here at the Windows machine. Jim's actually going to use the QuickTime Player. One of the new features of QuickTime Player is an open URL option. So we can go in and select. You're actually going to type this. There you go. Let's hit a recent history. So we can select an MP3 file that's on an HTTP server, hit OK, and there it goes. You can see you can see the dotted outline there, which actually means the entire file isn't available. It's telling you as you watch on the left, the lines fill. So we can select an MP3 file that's on an HTTP server, hit OK, and there it goes. You can see you can see the dotted outline there, which actually means the entire file isn't available. It's telling you, as you watch on the left, the lines filling, and it's telling you what part of the file has already been downloaded. So you can go ahead and start playing that now. And you can see the two keep going at the same time. This is really nice because it means either in the browser or in the QuickTime Player application, you can start listening to things right away. And if you're not on a really fast connection, as for some reason we aren't here today, that's really convenient. The other thing that we've got here in the drawer that we added are some controls that you can actually control how the audio sounds. Most importantly, a bass control. Turn that way up and turn the treble down. That really works very well. Go to the opposite extreme. Take the treble up. See this control actually turns out to be pretty useful for adjusting the audio that you're getting from a source, because they're not always tuned exactly the way you want it. And you can get that bass thumping good time you're looking for. The other nice thing about the bass and treble is the implementations of them. The team that did it actually found some incredibly clever ways to implement that. So you can do bass and treble adjusts in real time without any significant CPU hit at all, which I was just totally blown away when they showed me. It's a really great accomplishment. So let's stop that one from playing. See, if we had to wait for it to download, we'd still be back 5 minutes in the presentation. So it's good that we got past that. Without going, if we can go back to slides. Without going into all the details, I just wanted you to see and understand that everything that we do in QuickTime, you can do from your own application. QuickTime is an API. We just always show these applications. But there's all these different layers that you can actually use. So if you're using the Sound Manager and you'd like to add bass and treble controls to your app, you can do it with about, 5 lines of code here. If you're using Movie Player or the Movie Toolbox, you can do bass and treble with about the same number of lines of code. Really easy things to do. Take advantage of our work. Let's see if I can get to the next slide here. The EQ display, which is also pretty cool. Again, when we started to play with the new user interface, we had a lot of debate about this, whether it was completely gratuitous or kind of cool. And we all decided that in the end it was gratuitous and cool, so it was okay, and it stayed in. But again, actually doing an EQ display in real time is somewhat of a challenge to do it well. And we spent a lot of time optimizing this and making it look, we think, pretty great. And now you can actually call this again from your own application, either using the Sound Manager or the Movie Toolbox. So this kind of capability that you see, almost everything that you see in QuickTime Player is an API somewhere that you can call and use. And that's something that you should be thinking about. And I hope you take away from this session is that if you see us doing something, it's something you can do in your product. And it's probably not that hard to do. Because if we can do it, anyone can. Another one of the technologies that's in QuickTime that we haven't been talking about too much lately, but we've actually been doing some pretty interesting work, is QuickTime VR. QuickTime VR is, as you know, a really great way for taking still photographs and making them just sort of come alive. When we first did QuickTime VR, it was maybe in 1984. It's 1994. Would have been a trick. And it was written to run on 68030 and 68040 Macintoshes. And so we had to take a lot of shortcuts to make QuickTime VR perform fast, because what was most important was to get the performance great. We sort of realized a little while ago that the machines have gotten a lot faster, and we haven't gone back and looked at the shortcuts that we took. So what we've got here on the top of the screen is QuickTime VR 1.0, and on the bottom, through a little bit of magic, we also have QuickTime VR, sort of what's in QuickTime 4 running. You can see Jim panning around, and if you notice that it shimmered a little bit as he was panning. With the QuickTime VR 4, you notice it's basically just completely smooth. It's like you're just panning a photograph. It's really sweet. And so as he keeps moving around, it looks pretty good. So if you want to go down and maybe take a look at the rocks that are down there. This is actually taken from El Capitan, which is a pretty interesting place to be. You can see VR 1 was pretty amazing for its time. Looked pretty nice. Those rocks shimmer like mad, though. And then we come down here. Again, it's just perfectly, gorgeously smooth. And we'll come back up and look at those guys on the rocks again, if we can. A little hard doing both of these at the same time. can see it's a good spot. So we're going to go back there. This machine's being a little bit uncooperative today, but kind of there. And so again, so this is panning, and then the other thing obviously we do in VR a lot is zooming. And so not only did we fix up panning, but also you notice here's zooming. And when you notice this down here, that the zooming, again, the quality just stays gorgeous all the way through. The image doesn't get anywhere near as aliased. It just stays looking like a photograph, which is what it started as. So this really does change fundamentally what the experience is of using QuickTime VR and makes it what it should be on a G3 computer in 1999. So we're pretty excited about this. We think this gives all those people who love QuickTime VR out there reasons to love it even more. We've done a lot of other things to VR in this release, and we'll be talking about those tomorrow at the interactivity session. So let's go on and talk about graphics. You know, QuickTime is thought of, thanks. QuickTime is thought of as a system to do video. The only thing that is sometimes overlooked is that to do video, you need all this low-level stuff. You need great graphics infrastructure. You need great audio infrastructure. We talked about audio a little bit. Now we'll cover the video part, the graphics part of QuickTime, which is sort of the underpinning that the video is built on top of. In the beginning, and up until really through QuickTime 3, there was pretty much only support for RGB color spaces in QuickTime. You know, the kinds of things that your computer display does naturally. In QuickTime 4, we've really opened that up so that you can pretty much plug in any color space you want to have support for. What you see on the screen now is a list of all the different color spaces that QuickTime 4 has built-in support for. There's other people who have actually added other spaces as well. The most interesting two on here, I just want to point them out, are CCIR 601. For those of you who aren't video industry gearheads, that is television. And that's the native color space of television. It's a really good thing to have in a video engine. And then the other one that I think is a really exciting one is 64-bit ARGB, which means you can actually have 16-bit per channel images, which for doing high-end kinds of operations is a really great, really important thing. And we've added this in such a way that it remains compatible with applications that just support 32-bit RGB. So that's pretty cool. If you have 64-bit RGB images, they get really wide. Robytes, which is the number of bytes per scan line, gets huge. Traditionally, you couldn't do an image on macOS that was bigger than 14 or 15 bits of robytes, which meant your widest image was about 4,000 pixels wide. During the 8.5 release process, we looked and said, oh, that's a drag. We know how to get this up to 32 bits, so you can have images as wide as possible. So through the process that Steve Glass talked about in the last session, where we're very careful about making changes and not doing anything too close to the last minute, we snuck in the changes so that wide robytes actually works on macOS 8.5. So now you can call new Gworld, and you can ask for an image that's, 16,000 pixels wide, and assuming you have some memory, you'll actually get it. This is available on 8.5 or later on Macintosh, but also available on all Windows platforms since we patch out all of QuickDraw there, or carry it over. We don't patch it. There's some functions that you want to use to get in set robytes. We couldn't just change the structure in place. So QuickTime 4 contains some accessor functions which let you do that. And all the codecs in QuickTime 4 have been updated to use this. So you can draw QuickTime images and movies into incredibly wide Gworlds, and they just work. So what's the next slide? Press the button one more time. You go, ooh, demonstration. We're going to look at a really wide image. Cool. Come over to the Macintosh, please. So what Jim has here is a JPEG image that was given to us by a photographer named Stephen Johnson. He's a digital photographer. He has an amazing website, actually, if you want to check it out. This image is about 10,000 pixels wide. You have to bear with us here for a minute. This is a photograph of the Badlands in South Dakota. And Jim is just kind of continuing to move through it. This is something we couldn't have done with the previous version of QuickTime. You can see the title bar coming into view, so we're about halfway through. And if he keeps going here eventually, and it does take a while, we get to the really nice mountains and stuff. Stephen takes these things and makes QuickTime VR panoramas and things out of them. But the idea here is that we've really sort of broken the barrier of what you can do with image on Macintosh. So there's no more restrictions on image size. And that opens up a number of possibilities for people. We'll move that back. We're not GM yet, it's okay. A number of possibilities for people, and the number of changes you have to make in your application to support this are typically something close to 0. So not a lot of hard work there. So let's take that down and go on to the next demo. One of the other things that we've done is added support for, sort of improved our support for Photoshop images. Jim has here an image showing just how pervasive the iMac has become. As you know, if you use Photoshop, you know how this was done. It was done with layers, and there's lots of them. QuickTime 3 supported the display of Photoshop images using our graphics importers, but you couldn't get it all as independent layers. With QuickTime 4, we've actually added support for that. So Jim can now kind of go through here, and you can see all the different pieces that make up this image. There's a shadow underneath the iMac itself, of course, the wallaby, and that's the end of it. So you can very easily, from any application, access all the different layers of Photoshop, which again makes it really easy to do some kinds of things that were previously really hard. So let's go on to the next one. Something else we added support for in QuickTime 4, to sort of finish. Okay. Oh, yeah. Now we know why the VR pans weren't as smooth as we wanted.
Want to see VR again?
Yeah, maybe. Anyway. So we added support for FlashPix. This is a picture some of you may have seen. FlashPix is a format defined by, of all companies, Kodak, HP, and of course Microsoft. So we thought Bill was a great person to help us show it. We can zoom into it and sort of pan around. We can resize the image. And what's nice about this, as you start to zoom in more, you see what Bill is made of course. Or at least has plenty of. Anyway, so we can sort of zoom in here, and you get progressively higher resolutions. In fact, if you kind of look around, it looks pretty great. The thing that's interesting about FlashPix, and the reason that it's a really intriguing file format, is it stores images. It doesn't store the image once, it stores it multiple times at different resolutions. So that basically means that to get any zoom magnification of the image in any part of the image is incredibly fast, because you always are reading about the same amount of data. So we built FlashPix support right into QuickTime 4, and we built it in ways that you can do this kind of thing incredibly easily, so that you can look around and create these things. Live Picture has some great tools for doing this. Okay? So that's the FlashPix support. Let's go back to slides here for a moment, if we can. Both the Photoshop demo you just saw and the FlashPix demo are built on some multi-image support that's in graphics importers. Back when we started doing graphics importers, we had this naive idea that a graphics file only ever has one picture in it. It seemed like a good idea, but it's not true. FlashPix, Photoshop, and TIFF all have multiple images. And so in QuickTime 4, we have some APIs that let you iterate through those images. It's incredibly easy to do. If you need to use this capability, it should take you no time at all to integrate it into your product. Oops, backing up. So we have graphics importers, but we never had graphics exporters. And many of you pointed this out to us last year, and you were right. And so we took some time and added graphics exporters. Lots of applications have added support for graphics importers because they're an incredibly easy way to get support for just about every graphics image file format that's out there today for display. We expect and we hope that you'll go back, and over the next 6 months, next year, when you're updating your products, you'll take advantage of graphics exporters. So using one API, you'll be able to support these 10 different file formats today. And again, as we add new formats in the future, those will transparently be available to people who are using your application. How easy is it to add graphics exporter support to your application? So let's take a look here. Here's the entire code that takes a GWorld and exports it to a PNG file. It's all you have to do. Basically, you open up the graphics importer you want, in this case PNG, tell it which GWorld you're using, tell it what file you want it to put the image into, and then call export. And that's it. So this isn't exactly rocket science. The API suite, in case you want to make it hard, does have something like 70 different calls. So you do get a lot of control over this stuff if you want it, but you don't have to make it hard on yourself if you don't want to. So let's take a look at what graphics exporters look like in action, some of the different options that they provide you. Here we have a JPEG image. This is a standard dialog you can bring up as part of the graphics exporter API, so you don't even have to write this if you don't want to. You can see all the different formats that are supported. Choose something like TIFF. Look at the options. Each format, if it has options, has its own dialog for things like compression and so forth. Let's go to JPEG here for a moment and just export one of those. One of the things that we did in the JPEG, which was it's kind of useful actually, is the ability to specify the target size of the image. So if you're making web pages and you know what size you want these to be, you can just say, I want this image to be 9K and no bigger, more or less. Hit OK. We'll go and make that image. And if we go and take a look at that in Finder, what you'll see is it's, within 100 bytes, it's 9K. And of course, if you open it then, since it's been compressed more, it's a little bit more banded, but basically looks as good as the original image in that case. So it's a kind of a sophisticated feature that we make really, really easy for you to get at. Related, and the final point on the graphics front here, I think, for a moment, is visual effects. We added visual effects, which are like special effects, video effects, in QuickTime 3, and had tons of them. There were like 180 of them. We didn't add 180 more new ones in QuickTime 4. I thought we could hold for a while. But some of the engineers just didn't have enough fun in 3, so they added a couple more. So if we can just take a look at those quickly. The first one was sort of one you see in every television commercial today is a lens flare. So you can see this sort of just being overlaid on top of the image. You can actually, there's a program that we'll post soon on the website that lets you redesign the flare to anything you want it to be. What's sort of important here to note is you've seen lens flares before, but normally what you do is you see lens flares that have been rendered at several minutes per frame, offline and then played back. This is actually being rendered in real time so that you can just drop lens flares on top of arbitrary images. And they look almost as good as the things that take forever. So that's one of the new effects. The other one is a transition, which you can use to do zooms. This is a little bit more of our Australian iMac theme. So you can sort of set this looping and watch this koala think a lot back and forth. And it does interpolated scaling and all this stuff, so it ends up looking really good. So a couple more effects. If you're using visual effects in your product today, you pick these up for free. If you're looking for more gratuitous effects as a reason for adding QuickTime effect support, these is them. We can go back to slides. People commented our blur and sharpen weren't as blurry and sharp as they should be, and they were kind of slow, so we fixed those up. They're much better now. The other thing that's important is that when we first announced QuickTime Effects, of course, there weren't really many applications that support it. There are now some really important applications that support it. Adobe Premiere and Final Cut Pro both have support for QuickTime Effects. So if you write an effect to the QuickTime API, you can automatically be supported in both of these applications. And some of the interactive authoring tools are also now supporting QuickTime Effects, including Electrifier Pro and a new one called iShell. Movie exporters. It's really important once you've got a system for playing back and creating media to be able to output it into formats that people are using. QuickTime 3 had a whole bunch of exporters for QuickTime files and formats and things like that, but didn't support some other industry standards. So we added some things that were sort of necessary. Image sequence, so you can take and make every frame of the movie a separate picture file. This is kind of fun if you've got a lot of time on your hands. And of course, it uses a graphic exporter, so any format that graphic exporters support can be exported. We had support for flick files because it was something to do. And a little bit more useful, we added support for AVI files. So let's take a look at a demo of that, actually. It's not that we really encourage you to use AVI files, but there are times when you might have to. So we have a Windows machine, which is obviously where AVI files are most commonly used. We have a QuickTime clip here.
Fear attracts the fearful.
From a movie that you pretty much can't see enough of today. What we're going to do is make an AVI file out of this using a QuickTime movie exporter. First thing we do is make it half size, since that's the way people are used to seeing AVI files. It's kind of small. We're going to go to the export dialog. Jim's going to look on the pop-up. These are all the different exporters that are available. We can go to different audio formats and whatever. Something else new that we've added is not only does it remember your last export setting, which is incredibly useful, but there's also a set of presets. So when you go to a different exporter, common settings are already there, so you don't have to go and configure it. So we're just going to choose 1x CD-ROM, which is basically going to make a movie that is 150K bytes a second, more or less, and is using Cinepack, which is sort of the thing that AVI still gets used the most with. So we'll grind through this here for a little bit, and then we will have an AVI file. And that AVI file, of course, is bound to the Windows Media Player.
Fear attracts the fearful.
You can play that. That's Microsoft's Media Player that just went away. It's a great interface. Just when you were kind of thinking there was something on your screen, it's gone again. But it makes sense, I'm sure. Anyway, so anyway, you can see it works. So if you need to make AVI files, like, it's incredibly easy now. If you don't have to make AVI files, I'm not going to encourage you to make more of them, but that's your choice. Anyway, back to slides for a minute. Movie importers. Movie importers are probably one of the most important parts of the QuickTime architecture. It's what lets us sneak all kinds of new features in. The Flash stuff that you saw this morning is supported by a movie importer that just made that work. A lot of the streaming support, the way that it becomes compatible with your app, is through movie importers. Two things that I really wanted to tell you about today that have changed in a big way. One is that we support import in place for MIDI and text files, which we didn't used to do. This annoyed a whole lot of people and made us have to give really lame answers for why you couldn't do it. The way it works is really incredibly clever and confusing, and so I'm not going to try to explain it here, but suffice it to say the great mystery called the handle data handler is the thing that's responsible if you want to look into it some more. We also did two things for our AVI support. You know, there is still a fair amount of AVI running around on the internet and running around on Windows machines. So we did two things. One, we added support for progressive download so that just like MP3s, just like QuickTime files, you can watch AVI files before they've completely downloaded. The last time I tried to do this with the Microsoft Media Player, I had to download it all first. So it may turn out that QuickTime is the best way to view your AVI files if you're a Windows user, which is kind of nice. The other thing that we worked on is we worked some more with the folks at Intel. Intel has made this family of video codecs called Indeo. We have had Indeo 4 was in QuickTime 3, Indeo 3 was in QuickTime 2, but Indeo 4 wasn't in QuickTime 3 for Mac, and then there was Indeo 5, which wasn't anywhere. So it's gotten really simple. It's gotten really simple. All Indeo 3, 4, and 5 are like actually available and work with QuickTime 4 on both Mac and Windows. So if you run into any Indeo content, you're there. Again, this isn't to say that you should be making all your content in Indeo format, but it's there if you want to use it, if you need to use it, you want to make AVI files with Indeo, you can do that. And so that's a great thing. Flash. Flash is one that I think is one of the more interesting new features of QuickTime 4. We worked with Macromedia to do this so that we could really support everything that Flash 3 does within QuickTime. This isn't a layer of Flash that we wrote. It's actually, we worked with Macromedia to do this based on their sources, so it's incredibly compatible. But we also added a few things so that QuickTime support goes beyond just being able to play back Flash. You have kind of two big extra areas here. One is support for wired actions. This means that you can have the buttons in a Flash presentation control the rest of the QuickTime movie. So you can make little movie controllers out of Flash. And then secondly, we support transparency with Flash. And what that lets you do is overlay Flash on top of movie so that you can have those controls not just be in a distinct window or a distinct part of the screen, but actually right on top of it and composite them in real time. I think Phil showed you an example of that this morning. So let's go and look at a demonstration. If I click the button. So first thing I want to show you on a Macintosh is something that you probably haven't seen before, is an AVI file progressively downloading from a server that contains Indeo 5 content. This is one of the, again, you see the sort of progressive there.
Through this door is the power to make the internet come to life. Making up a mess of fun. Making up a mess of fun. Introducing the Pentium 3 processor. Don't just get onto the internet, get into it. Find out how at Intel.com.
While it is like any no internet I've ever seen, I bet you weren't predicting this morning that you would see Intel commercials played and would be telling you that this is great because now we support Indeo 5 on Mac. But there it is. And in fact, we have both the compressors, the decompressor and the compressor, so you can make Indeo 5 content there. And it's really great, actually, that Intel has been working with us to do this, to make sure that Macintosh users and QuickTime users have access to the different technologies they've developed. Again, I'd like to just show you Flash here briefly. This is coming off of an HTTP
Welcome
server.
to Energy Design.
Actually, we'll go open that one more time, and if you watch the play bar when Jim opens it, you'll see that it is, in fact, progressively downloading as well. So it is starting to play this before it's
Welcome to Energy Design.
Again, this is really nice because it means you can right away. This is Flash. It's completely supporting all of the interactivity of Flash. So as sort of Jim goes around and clicks on things, different drawers appear. This one's sort of out of control, but you know, whatever. The other great thing about Flash, in addition to it being incredibly fast and being great for doing vector graphics, is that it scales. So if you resize the window, all of this keeps going and still looks just great because there's vector graphics just being scaled on the fly. So, again, look at Flash as being another choice in your palette of tools that you can use with QuickTime. If you want to embed some Flash graphics into your application as part of your UI, you can now do that. It's completely transparent to do. It's really, really easy. So that was a Flash demo. I got to check my notes. I know what's next. OK. Next one is to show you what we can do with wired movies. Flash, as I said, supports wired actions. And that's how, actually, when you're clicking through the Flash, when Jim was just clicking through the Flash presentation, we were able to have it respond in different ways. But we can use wired movies for a number of other things. One of the biggest requests we've had from people is, I would like to be able, in my web page, to have a QuickTime movie, but I don't want to have the standard QuickTime movie controller. I want to be able to create my own look. So what we've done is made it possible to have multiple QuickTime movies in the same web page communicate with each other. So what we actually have here are two movies, one which you've seen way too much of, and one which you probably haven't seen as much of. They are completely separate elements in the page, but when Jim clicks play on the bottom one, you see it actually starts the other one playing.
We're not condone a course of action that will lead us to.
Kind of play backwards. Quite as well. But anyway, the idea here is that you can actually build your own user interface using QuickTime. Why would you want to do this? Two reasons. One, if you've already got QuickTime on your web page, you've got all this technology at your disposal already. And QuickTime has, as we've seen, some pretty amazing graphic capabilities that are difficult at best to reproduce with dynamic HTML. The other thing is that anybody who makes web pages knows that as soon as you start putting 7 different media technologies into one web page, the odds of it actually ever working go way down. So by being able to use QuickTime to do all of the stuff in your web page, the user only has to get one plugin, and we think there's an incredibly high possibility that it will actually work, and that's really important. So let's look at a couple more examples of what you can do with wired movies. We'll do these in Movie Player, but you can pretty much do them anywhere. This is one that is a mountain biking demo. So it's put together using LiveStage. What this one lets you do basically is use the controls on the left to view different portions of the presentation, and also switches the soundtrack. Click through that. And there's some play pause controls. And then the wired movie can also have other things you'd expect, like a URL link. So if Jim clicks here, we will shell out to Internet Explorer and actually open a web page. I think something you should know is you actually can, from that open URL link, open another window in Movie Player or replace the current movie. So you can actually create some pretty complex navigations using QuickTime's internet support without ever having to go into the browser. And because you can do those things in QuickTime Player, it means you can also do them in your application. So let's get one more example. This is sort of the ultimate extreme of wired movies. This is really not anything to do with QuickTime at all, other than it does show you that using the wired movie support that's in QuickTime, you can create games, which is pretty much the most important measure of any technology. And it really does have state and can keep score, and it's way harder to play than we ever thought. So anyway, let's go back to slides here for a moment. So wired movies are a great way to add interactivity to QuickTime Media. In QuickTime 3, they were only supported by the Sprite Media Handler. In QuickTime 4, they're supported in all kinds of things like Flash and VR and text and 3D and sprites. Tons of information on this in the other session tomorrow. Something else that's really important. When we first announced wired movies last year at this conference, and there were no tools apart from sort of the things that we had written. There's now a bunch of tools that exist for working with wired movies, and they're really pretty great. LiveStage is absolutely amazing. Electrifier Pro is great. And you should check these things out if you're at all interested in this, because they do let you do some pretty sophisticated things. Never thought we'd get to streaming, did you? So this is sort of the big part of QuickTime 4. And what I don't want to do is just show you QuickTime streaming, though we'll do a little bit of that. But what I want to really help is to make sure that when you leave today, that you actually really understand what streaming is, why it's different, and understand some of the technologies that are being used and the limitations and implications of using those. So we're going to go through some of the architecture of streaming today and explain to you why things are the way they are, so that as you're incorporating streaming into your product, if that's what you're doing, you'll be aware not just of what the APIs are, but really what's going on underneath. Most people who use QuickTime in their applications are using it to play back movies. If you were following our advice from the last 7 years and using the standard movie controller, there's a really good chance you won't have to do anything to make your app compatible with QuickTime streaming. If you were playing movies directly using the movie toolbox, which there's plenty of good reasons to do, you will have to make some small changes. Those will be outlined in tomorrow's internet session. It's the kind of thing that won't take you too long to do, but if you don't do it, you won't be able to play streaming content because it is quite different from today's QuickTime movies. And we didn't want to introduce an entirely new API to support streaming. We just wanted to sort of build on what we had to make your jobs as easy as possible, to make sure that every application on Macintosh and Windows that wanted to support QuickTime streaming could do so. So we've talked about standards. Steve talks about standards, and I thought it might be good to tell you just a little bit more about some of these standards so that instead of just hearing the letters thrown around, when you're at a cocktail party, you can give a one-sentence description of what it is too, and people will think that you really understand this stuff. So that's nice. So the first one that we throw around a lot is RTSP. RTSP is a connection protocol. It's when you type in a URL, you type in, for QuickTime streaming, you type in RTSP : //. And it's a TCP-based connection that is used to tell the server, I want to see this stream. You tell the machine some things about, maybe I want it at this connection speed. But actually, QuickTime does that in the opposite direction. But anyway, never mind. You tell it some things about yourself, and it gives you a stream back. And in the return information, it will tell you which formats it's going to use for compression and so forth. RTSP is an IETF, which is the Internet Engineering Task Force draft standard that was actually, if I'm remembering this correctly, first proposed by Real Networks. And they use it for some things, but we use it for everything. So definitely, a streaming standard. The other thing that we use is RTP. RTP is a network layer. It's basically a layer on top of UDP, which is a very low level of the whole network stack thing. And it basically defines some standard packet headers to make it easy to do compatible streaming. By using RTP, and the compression technologies below that you see listed are all defined RTP payloads for, which means that all of these are standard ways to broadcast. What that means is, if there's somebody out there using RTP for broadcast, and that's basically anybody using the M-bone today, which is used in academia for a lot of multicasts and broadcasts on the internet, you can tune into those with QuickTime because we already support that standard. It also means that there's products like IPTV from Cisco that were constructed long before QuickTime streaming was available, and we can just tune into those broadcasts directly. So by using these standards, we gain compatibility with a bunch of stuff that's out there already without having to do a whole lot of work and foisting new things on the universe. On the other side of standards, there's places where we believe there need to be some standards, but there aren't quite yet. And so we're really working to help create some standards there. And we need your help in order to make this successful. The first one we talked about a little bit last year is the QuickTime file format. For streaming QuickTime 4, the format that we use on the server is QuickTime. Makes sense. We had to add some enhancements to it to support streaming so that the server knows how to broadcast the packets on the appropriate network. Those extensions are exactly what we proposed to the ISO organization as part of the MPEG-4 standard, and we are now working with them to make the QuickTime file format the basis for MPEG-4. And what that means is we will finally have a standard format for passing around streaming content, that you can take content from one vendor's server and move it to another and have it work. We think that's important because we think there needs to be more than one vendor for servers. Apple makes a Mac OS X server, but Apple doesn't make a Linux server. Apple doesn't make a Sun server. But to make sure that those things can happen, we've actually made the source code to our server available to anybody to download. And so we expect to see versions for these platforms not too far out there. It also means that lots of people can actually learn about these technologies, and it's not all a big secret. The thing that I actually wanted to tell you about this morning's webcast, just for a minute before we get into the other demos. So you know, as you were sitting here watching Steve live doing the show, there were a few other people around the world who were actually watching the webcast. We just got the numbers in this afternoon, and I wanted to share them with you. So this hall holds like 2,000 or 3,000 people, something like that. The internet holds more. And so when we webcast Steve this morning, we've only had QuickTime out there for a month, so we really didn't know what to expect. We've done some other events, and we've had a bunch of people tune in, but you know, you never know with Steve how many people he might attract. So we put the thing up there. The announcement actually only went up on Sunday. So there wasn't a whole lot of forewarning about this. And we had, at peak today, watching Steve, over 17,000 simultaneous connections tied into QuickTime streaming. So that's like a lot of people for like, you know, in your first month of streaming. And the network actually worked, and the software actually worked. That's basically using the server source code that like you can go and download off the web today. The other thing that, that was actually, there's over 60,000 different people tuned in during different parts of it, so they didn't all stay, unfortunately. But the other thing that was really amazing and just sort of, to me, shows sort of what the power of great content is that in Japan, it was 2 in the morning when the keynote started. And you know, I don't usually get up at 2 in the morning to watch streaming content on the web. But 1,000 people in Japan were up like watching QuickTime streaming content of the keynote, which was amazing, just amazing. So it's really important to have great content, and we really like Star Wars. So let's see a demo here of some of what we can do with QuickTime streaming. You've seen it running on Windows, on Macintosh, so thought we would show you just, you know, just to prove to you that it works, that we really do everything the same on Windows. Just a really simple streaming movie here. Which one is this? Oh, this isn't the one I thought. Yeah, so this is actually the demo. We're going to get a little bit of a loop back here. This is us here now. This is actually kind of a big deal. I should actually mention this. QuickTime streaming just totally reduces the cost of doing these events so that any pinhead, even us and the QuickTime engineering team, can set up a machine backstage, go run around wildly and find the video feed, connect it in, and as long as we have a Reflector network somewhere, we can broadcast this out to the universe. It really doesn't cost that much to do because you're not paying a fortune for the server. We'll take that down because it could be a little distracting to watch the rest of the session on a several-second delay. We'll go on to the next piece of streaming content over here. This is actually a 40 kilobit stream, so you can watch this on a 56K modem, just to give you an idea of the kind of quality that you get at those bit rates, which is pretty amazing. The Sorensen guys are great, totally great. Over here, we're going to look at a couple different pieces of content just to sort of round out a few things here. In the web browser, one of the things you need to know is that you can't right now type RTSP:something into your web browsers. It doesn't work, so you have to embed it in a web page. So here we have a streaming web page, very professionally made, I might add, with a movie in it that we'll go ahead and play. This is the kind of thing you see a lot of with streaming video.
Pork bellies are unchanged. Frozen concentrated orange juice, up 3.5.
A lot of news, a lot of business. We love Bloomberg, but a lot of news. So the other place, of course, that we said with QuickTime is you can put it in any application. As long as you actually use the standard QuickTime movie controller, it'll work. And the guys on the Microsoft Macintosh team do a great job of this. They, in the current shipping version of Excel, have great QuickTime support. They use a regular movie controller. So, you know, Jim, being the pork bellies trader that he is, obviously has, you know, his spreadsheet ready with all his information, and he can just tune in and get the latest.
Pork bellies are up in active trading. Frozen concentrated orange juice remains unchanged.
You see the really compelling information that you can get. But you can drop this stuff right into your application. You can put QuickTime streaming content right in there. Your application can just change on the fly as you put new content up there. And Jim can calculate why he's not going to be working with us much longer. Okay, so that's sort of the basics of what you can do with streaming. You see it's pretty easy to do, compatible with a lot of existing applications. You should check it out and see if it's compatible with yours. If it's not, you want to make sure you go to the QuickTime Internet session on tomorrow afternoon. But now what we'd like to do is sort of walk you through, as I said, some of the low-level technologies that actually make up QuickTime streaming. And I just sort of have to say, ahead of time that this is one of the more difficult presentations that we've ever had to do. Traditionally, excuse me, didn't fall over. Traditionally, we do a stupid movie for the WWDC. And, we make that the week ahead, and it's sort of interesting, and it gives the engineers something to do instead of fix bugs. We thought with QuickTime-4, what was the big deal? Well, it's that you can do live broadcasts. We didn't want to broadcast it because that didn't seem to make a lot of sense. So we're going to talk about, as soon as I can find the clicker, there we go. We're going to talk about the QuickTime streaming architecture with a little help from our friends. So I hope somebody moves the slide forward here soon. There we go. So let's talk about how stored streaming works. Well, you got a streaming server on one side, and you got a client on the other. And you might think that this is really simple. What you do is you take your frames from your server, and you pick them up, and you just send the whole frame over to the client. And so the server takes that frame, hands it off to the network goes and gives it to the client, and life is good. Client may have to do some work on the frame depending on how good the server is, but more or less that's the way it works. So that's how you think it works. That sort of makes the most sense anyway. Unfortunately, that turns out not to be exactly the case. To put packets on the network, you've got to break them into pieces, right? The network can't take a 5K frame. It may only be able to take a 1.5K frame. So on the server, what we do is when we put the file into QuickTime format, we break it into packets ahead of time in a process we call hinting. So then we end up with a bunch of partial frames. So the server hands out these partial frames, and they go across the network as best they can. And when they get to the other side, there's a piece of software inside of QuickTime called the reassembler. The reassembler kind of hangs out. It's got pieces of frames. And when it looks like it's got a frame, it'll kind of take those, put them together, and actually give them up so that the client can see it. So that's the basic process of reassembly. Now, of course, nothing is ever as easy as it looks because the network is an unpredictable lot. And packets don't always arrive at the same rate. So as the server starts handing out the packets, is there like a server handing out packets somewhere? As the server starts handing out packets to the network, some of them will he may do it in order. So he'll send out, the first part of frame 1 and then second part of frame 1, frame 2, and they won't necessarily all arrive at the same time, right? Because, the transport may go over different parts. Some of the packets are a little lazy. Some of them are a little confused. Some of them are way too clever for their own good. And you can't always rely on the network to behave rationally. And this is true. So the reassembler has to deal with this. And you got to trust that the reassembler is going to be pretty smart, or things may not work right. This is why when you start something playing, even though this is real-time streaming, right? In theory, we're putting up the frames as fast as they arrive. You see a short delay where QuickTime says negotiating and buffering. And that buffering time is being used by QuickTime to build up about 3 or 4 seconds of packets so that if things arrive out of order, things arrive a little bit fast in groups that don't necessarily make sense, the packetizer, the reassembler, can take those frames, sort them out, and present them to you in the correct order so that what you end up with is a presentation that looks right. So that's why you sometimes see these buffering delays. That's also why you sometimes want to change the buffering delay. And you can do that as a content provider. So if you're traveling over a relatively flaky network, you may want to increase the buffering delay. By default, we do about 3 seconds, but we don't really recommend you do it less than that. You'll also note that our 3-second buffering delay is about half what anybody else does for streaming media. So we actually get things started playing much faster than anybody else out there. There's another problem that plagues networks, and that's one of packet loss. This is starting to look like a video game. When you use like a normal internet web browser, the packets all get there. You don't end up with half of your web page missing. And that's because they're using TCP to transport the frames. And TCP guarantees a reliable transport. It does this, however, at the expense of real time. So you may get delays, and you see that when you're loading a web page, you'll get a hiccup. And that's because the data may have to be retransmitted. QuickTime streaming, you sometimes just don't know what happens. A packet is going to disappear. Maybe because a router was busy and didn't know what to do. Maybe because too many things were sent to your modem port at one time. The reasons are irrelevant. But what happens is that the reassembler has to deal with that. And the reassembler does the best it can. So what we have in QuickTime are a bunch of reassemblers that actually know about data loss. So if only half of a frame arrives, we try to put that half frame up so that you see as much as going on as possible instead of seeing things stall. That's a big deal because on the internet at large, if you just start throwing UDP packets out there on a good day, about 5% of them never get to the other side. Why? Don't know, doesn't matter. On a bad day, if you've got 17,000 people watching Steve Jobs and things are getting a little busy, the packet loss may go up a little bit more. At that point, you want to make really sure that you can handle that data loss. So we've really built QuickTime to be able to deal with those lost packets. More sad realities of streaming. Firewalls. Okay. So the thing is, sometimes the firewall will get sent a, you'll try to send a packet. This happens in corporate networks a lot. The admins have to have control. And so a packet will come to the firewall, will get sent out by the server, and the firewall will pretty much just bounce it. Do we have a packet we're sending here somewhere? Is that a packet that might get bounced? I don't know. Oh yeah, there you go. And the reason that firewalls exist is because sometimes in your life you will encounter a packet which is incredibly suspicious and shouldn't get through your network. So the firewall will check its list of known protocols and packet types and will send Dave scrambling back sadly away. The problem, of course, is there's other kinds of data which you will see that do make it right through. Tom's pretty much not happy right now. The firewall is not really happy with QuickTime because it doesn't know about it. But it may encounter web types, data types that it knows, like HTTP, like a web page. So the web page gets right through, goes to the client, and life is good. So how do you get around this problem? What you got to do is you got to go out and invest in a proxy server. The great thing about proxy servers is they're completely non-standardized. So here's our proxy server. The proxy server has got to know something about your firewall. You can't just go get any proxy server. But they're friends. They kind of know each other. Life is good. So now as we start to send packets through here from the server, our little QuickTime streaming broadcast here, what happens is as we send it through, the proxy server will actually go and sort of deal with the evils of the firewall and make sure that the packets get through so that you as the client can see things. Now, as I said, firewalls are really ugly because there's absolutely no standard in how they work. And so depending on what your system is, your system admin is, they may have to go just throw a couple switches, or they may have to go do a lot of work. You may have to even go get an upgrade to your proxy server. It's not an easy situation. It's something that's just going to take some time to sort out, but it's something you have to be aware of. What we have done to make this easier is just like our streaming server we've made available in open source, we've made the source code to a QuickTime proxy server freely available so that if you want to go and either make a product out of a proxy server, which we'd love to see you do, or whether you just need to go use that so that your system admin can go and set up a proxy server, you can do that. The other nice thing is because QuickTime's built on RTP and RTSP, which are standards, there are a number of firewalls out there today that just work with QuickTime streaming already. There's a big web page that explains all the details, but at least now you know what goes on inside that firewall. So this was all stored content. What we're going to do now is sort of talk about broadcasts. And broadcasts, again, are a little different. You go and get rid of the server for a minute. Oh, man, I pressed that button too fast. There we go, broadcast. What you need is a broadcaster, which is basically a camera and something compressing a lot. And you need the opposite side of a reassembler. You need a packetizer. So basically what happens is the broadcaster is capturing full live frames, in this case maybe some BBC. It hands it to the packetizer. The packetizer looks at them, removes the paperclip, and breaks them into packets, which it hands off to the network. Right, this all has to happen in real time. So you're getting the frames from your digitizer, you're compressing them, and breaking them into packets, which then get sent across the network. We've removed some of the more complicated proxy layers and things here to make things a little easier, but they could very well be involved. Because you're doing the compression in real time in this case, you really need to make sure you get basically the fastest machine you can possibly afford and then some in order to do this, because compressing video in real time can be a pretty complicated thing. Now this looks like a pretty easy setup. It seems like it shouldn't be that hard to scale this from one client to 700 clients. Unfortunately, that doesn't quite turn out to be the case. Here's how you kind of think it would be nice if it did work. What we got to do now is get ourselves another client who can receive these streams. You can see how multicast works. So what we're going to do is say, we've got a broadcaster. Again, he sends out one frame, gives it to the packetizer. The packetizer, again, takes that frame, breaks it in two, and is going to hand that off to the network. This packetization stuff is really hard, actually, apparently. We're going to take that frame and wander across to the network. And what happens is in the multicast situation is one packet flies across the network and basically gets given to each client so that one, you don't have to replicate the packets. They just sort of float around. Now, there are limits on how far multicast will go. So, this multicast may not make it past the edge of the stage, but other ones may, and it just sort of depends on how you've configured it. So multicast seems like a great thing. I have one broadcaster. It takes the frames, breaks them into packets, sends them across to 17,000 clients, all watching Steve Jobs, and life is good, right? We're done. No. Those firewall things have like sort of, an evil, ugly twin, and it's called the truth about multicast. Multicast works really good in your local zone. Once you get past your zone, you run into routers. Routers have to be multicast aware and configured to do multicast in order for it to actually work. And guess what? Most routers on the planet aren't set up to do multicast. So how do you deal with it? The answer is you go and you spend more money, unfortunately. You have to get something called a reflector. And you can see the picture gets more complicated and the money gets more interesting as well. Basically what happens in this case is we bring back the reflector. The reflector actually runs as a process on the server. So the server does two things. It handles stored content, and it also acts as a reflector. So what we do now is we run the broadcaster who takes the full frames, hands them off to the packetizer, who gives them to the network. And in this case, actually, with the live broadcast we're doing here, we're encoding here, we're sending to a reflector that's in New York. So they actually do go across the entire live internet. The reflector in New York then goes and breaks that into two pieces, one for each client that's currently viewing. And then each of those packets gets sent out separately to the clients. So this is where the scaling problems sort of run in, because obviously now you need a reflector that can handle as many simultaneous connections as you have. So the users feel like they're getting a multicast because they're watching a broadcast. But in fact, everybody who watched Steve this morning was watching a unicast. The only broadcast that was going on was between the broadcaster and the reflector, or the reflector farm in this case, in New York. The good news is that reflecting isn't that difficult an operation for a server to do. We've clocked the Mac OS X server that Apple is currently selling comfortably, very comfortably at handling 1,000 simultaneous connections. Most of us aren't going to do events with 1,000 people. So one machine, assuming you have enough network bandwidth, can handle what you're doing with reflecting. But this is an unfortunate thing to know. If you're working within your own corporation and you have some control over the internet or over your routers, you actually can set it up and you can do multicast. And the QuickTime client works with this, and the QuickTime broadcasters work with it. But you really do need to be aware of these reflectors and the need for them. It's something that over time will go away, but the period of time is probably more than 6 months and less than 6 years, which is too long for us to safely say when. So that's sort of the lay of the land for how the environment that QuickTime streaming has to work in. What packetizers are, things that break frames into pieces, what reassemblers are, things that deal with the network jitter, that deal with packet loss, that take different types and put them together. So I guess that's the end of our little live broadcast. We have a big hand for the QuickTime players, please. Much better than in rehearsal, so this is great. So big things you got to remember about streaming. The stage play you may not be able to do in your own application, but all the things that we talk about, all the things we've shown you today are things that you can pretty easily put into your own applications. You can create much more rich multimedia experiences. People buying iMacs aren't going to be the happiest in the universe with plain text user interfaces. You can use the capabilities of QuickTime to create really cool user interfaces in your app, interfaces that are easily and effortlessly tied back to the internet without having to do tons of work. And if you happen to deliver your application on Windows as well, those exact same QuickTime services can be used on Windows. So what we do, with QuickTime 4, we made it fast and incredibly easy to install to make sure that everybody has it with no excuses, made it work on Mac and Windows, added streaming, which is incredibly important, so you can do live events, and you can do all the kinds of things that people want to be able to do with streaming. We made sure, working with people like Macromedia for Flash, with Sorensen, with QDesign, that we have the best quality compressors, codecs that are available out there. I encourage you to go out there and compare what we're doing with the live feeds you see of QuickTime with what you see people doing with Real, with Microsoft NetShow. We think in the vast majority of the cases, you're going to find that QuickTime provides the best quality and, interestingly enough, at the best price because it's built on open standards. So I encourage you to come to the rest of the QuickTime sessions, to check out QuickTime 4. If you don't have it installed on your machine, you should, because it has the best looking media player that's ever been done. And, you know, check it out. Thanks so much for coming today.